Hi everyone, welcome to my presentation for the 95th joint session. I'm James Openshaw, a postdoc at the University of Warwick. I'm currently funded by a Mind Association, so this is a nice opportunity to share some of my ongoing work with you all. And I hope you feel free to leave a comment and questions down below and we can have a chat. I'd like to thank the organisers for keeping things running this year. In the interest of keeping things short, I will get started. As the title suggests, I'll be talking about memory. To start off here, it's useful to distinguish the various psychological operations which, in one way or another, depend on memory, and the distinctive process of conscious experiential remembering, that sort of recollective experience which is distinguished in part by its constitutive connection to multisensory or affective mental imagery, that kind of phenomenally rich imagery through which it seems to us that things were once a certain way in our past. I use the term imagery here and throughout, but I don't mean to endorse a kind of indirect representationalist view about memory experience. Well, on the topic of terminology, there is a bit of a mess here. What I'm calling experiential remembering often gets called episodic memory, or episodic recollection, in deference to this vast psychological literature that spun off of Tolving's work. But it's sometimes underappreciated, at least by philosophers, I think sometimes, that this suggests that what is recalled in experiential remembering must be an episode, a one-off specific event. And here are two representative quotes from psychologists that just make clear that this is what they have in mind. In that literature, it's more or less a criterion of episodic recollection that what is recalled as an episode. But I think from a philosophical point of view, repeated events such as your coffee preparation routine or the journey to the office you used to take pre-COVID, those repeated events can no less be the content of experiential rememberings, even if they lack some of the features that are distinctive of one-off episodic cases. Now, I think there are interesting reasons why the empirical literature has generally made one-off episodes so central to their inquiry. And I'm by no means suggesting that that's a bad thing to have done. But the possibility I want to start off by emphasizing now, and which I'll be trying to persuade you of throughout the talk, is that this approach is liable to overlook aspects of the phenomenon of experiential remembering which matter from a philosophical point of view. So for a philosopher of mind, our interest in experiential remembering is as a conscious, intentional occurrence about which we can ask questions like, what are its intentional objects? In what ways is it phenomenologically distinctive? Does it necessarily involve a sense of the self? How does it afford a form of knowledge about the past? And in the context of those projects, there's no obvious reason why we should focus on one-off episodic cases. And if anything, there's good reason, I think, to expect that it might blind us to cases where otherwise appealing claims about experiential remembering in general can be appreciated as incorrect. And with that in mind, you might wonder, well, if episodic memory concerns events, semantic memory concerns facts, procedural memory concerns skills, then where does a recall of objects fit in? I mean, of course, we can episodically recall an event in which one encountered an object, but is that the only way we do it? Is the only way of experientially recalling objects or people or places by experientially recalling events in which we encountered those things? That's kind of the question that will be the focus of this talk. I think the usual taxonomy, when conceived in those partly ontological terms at least, obscures some memory phenomena that are worth studying. And this isn't really a controversial point. I think most would agree that the standard taxonomy is, of course, incredibly useful, but it is not a perfect map of the mind. And it's for those sorts of concerns that the psychologist David Rubin has recently proposed this alternative dimensional organizational model, which is interesting. Now, you might think that a natural place to start would be with the assumption that experiential remembering can take as its object more or less anything that perceptual experience can. So it's about as heterogeneous with what it can represent as perception. So we can experience the core objects, events, maybe property instances, places, and things like that. So here's Don Locke expressing, I think, that kind of idea he uses slightly different terminology. He says experiential remembering can range over people, places, things, events, situations. It essentially involves mental imagery and consists in bringing some previously experienced thing to mind and going over what it was like, where the ability to do that depends on having experienced it. So I think in one sense, that is quite an intuitive place to start. And this is more or less what I want to argue for in this talk. You often see, though, quite independently of Tolking's influence, this idea that experiential remembering is constitutively concerned with events. So philosophers too have sometimes started out their discussions of experiential remembering with this sort of claim. He's broad. I remember him only so far as I remember events in which he was concerned. To remember a thing or person simply means to remember certain past events. More recently, John Campbell has said similar things. These are just representative quotes. The idea is that the ability to experience or recall objects or persons involves, or maybe just is, the ability to experience or recall occasions on which we encounter those objects. Now, the principle that suggests is eventism here. It says that for all ordinary objects, coffee cups, tables, people, in order for you to experience or recall that thing, you must experience or recall some past event or events in which you encountered it. Now, it seems to me that eventism is a substantive claim, which requires argument. And this is the claim that I'll be focusing on in this talk, and I'll be arguing against it. At the very least, I'd be happy with shifting the burden somewhat, so that the burden is not on those who are skeptical of it, but instead on those who positively assert it, because it seems like, or it is a positive claim about what experiential remembering is or what it involves. Now, this isn't to say that there aren't arguments for eventism. They don't really seem to appear in the literature. Eventism itself seems to be more tacitly endorsed than explicitly argued for. But actually, I think it is a seductive claim, and one of the reasons why it's natural to think is that it's natural to endorse the following principle, which entails it. And this says that to experience or recall something is to recall experiencing it. Because, of course, experiences are themselves events. So the natural thought encoded in experientialism here is that what we're doing when we experientially recall something is we're replaying a past experience of it. We sort of rewind our stream of consciousness and relive past experience again. And that does seem, at least metaphorically speaking, that does seem to be how we do it sometimes. But I think the increasing emphasis on constructive aspects of remembering provides reason to worry that experientialism is a naive claim about remembering in general, that it's false in general. And so any entailment to eventism is no support for eventism. So before arguing against eventism in detail, then, I want to finish this first section by briefly indicating where experientialism has problems. So here are our two principles, and we're thinking about whether experientialism is true and whether it therefore provides a kind of support for eventism. And I think the first kind of case that poses some difficulty for experientialism is remembering from the outside. So not infrequently when people recall events from their past, especially from the remote past, they recall them from an outsider point of view. Here's a quick example from Chris McCarroll's recent book. I'm seated on a rope swing, and I lose my grip, fall off, land on my back. I see myself as if from behind, run down the hill in panic. Now, here he's experiencing recalling falling off the rope swing and running down the hill. Does he recall experiencing falling off the rope swing and running down the hill? I don't think that's entirely clear. And a related kind of worry for experientialism are cases of remembering non-episodic events, general events, like, for example, swimming in the sea. No particular sea, no particular occasion, you just remember swimming in the sea. According to experientialism, what you're doing when you're experiencing recalling that general event is you're recalling experiencing it. So you recall experiencing that general event. But of course, what we experience isn't general, it's sort of necessarily particular. I'm now going to argue against eventism, and then I'll briefly sketch a positive alternative account of what it is to experience or recall an object without thereby experience of recalling an event or some events in which one encountered that thing. There are two things that I won't be doing that I'm going to remain completely neutral on, just to flag. The first is that it's compatible with everything I'll say, that the phenomena I'll be talking about and experience of recall in general is always a product of what gets called the episodic construction system, or the scene construction system. And it's also compatible with everything I'll say that there's only one kind of experience or remembering, and that experience and remembering objects is just one instance of that kind that has been overlooked. So I'm not saying that what I'm about to talk about is a distinct counter-natural kind. So there are a couple of ways you might develop a case against eventism. First, you might look to the empirical literature and note that work on memory consolidation, and in particular on semanticization, seems to posit processes which generalize the content of memory traces away from episodes and towards the general perceptible qualities of things encountered. So sometimes that literature appeals to schematic representations of the sort that can be sort of flexibly funneled into a general scene construction system in episodic feature thinking or counterfactual thinking. So you might conclude that those representations would be best describable as representing objects and places and familiar people and so on, rather than specific one-off events. I mean, that's somewhat speculative but interesting, I think, and I do explore that avenue in a fuller draft of these ideas. But I think you do have to be careful about how you interpret the relevant literature, and so in this talk I'll be exploring a different option, which is maybe there are necessary conditions on experientially remembering events, the absence of which can sometimes be introspected. So this is what I'm going to explore in the next few slides. Here I want to start off with a suggestive passage from the writer Vladimir Nabokov, in which he describes his childhood governess in a fairly unflattering way. He writes, "Mademoiselle rolled into our existence in 1905. There she is. I see so plainly her abundant dark hair, brushed up high and covertly greying, the 3 wrinkles on her austere forehead, her beetling brows, the steely eyes, and so on." So consider what he's doing when he's writing this passage. I think it's natural to say that he's experiencing recalling the person, but he's not experiencing recalling any particular event or events in which he perceptually encountered her. Well, he's doing something at a level more general than that. So there are suggestive quotes I have from some psychologists here as well that seem to be pointing to this sort of general memory phenomenon of what Brewer calls depersonalized memory of particular objects, and what Warren and Carmichael describe as being a composite image which shows an object or a person without any definite location and with no fixed surroundings or background. So what I think these remarks suggest is that you can represent not some spatial scene in which you yourself are situated viewing the person from some point of view. You're more or less just sensorily presented with the visual appearance or the characteristic look of the person or the object recalled. So there need be no sense that you're recalling some scene in which you're there seeing the thing. And yet, unlike fictional or hypothetical mere imagining, there's a sense in which what you're doing is past directed. It can be an integral part of this activity that you're remembering the way things were, and that you know that the thing may well just no longer look that way. And you presumably will know, given that you're remembering, that there were some occasions on which the thing manifested the look that you're remembering it having. But it doesn't follow from any of that what you're experiencing recalling is, or are those events on which it manifested that look. So I don't think that those considerations suffice to show that in the relevant cases one isn't experiencing recalling an event. More needs to be said here. When we look to the empirical literature, in their influential work on event memory, Dave Rubin and Shard Umanath say that in recalling an event, what you're doing is constructing a scene. You're representing an egocentric perspective from a specific spatial location. As Rubin goes on to say in a different paper, the act of constructing a scene forces the person to imagine themselves in one particular location, even if it represents multiple encodings. So suppose that you recall giving an in-person conference talk from the outside or from the inside. Either way, you're able to judge from where within the recalled space the presented perspective on things is located in egocentric terms. So you might see yourself as if from the back row of the lecture theatre, or you might see yourself as if from behind you, looking at this sea of faces. Either way, there's this sense that there's a spatial scene laid out, and the perspective on that scene is located somewhere within it. But in cases like that described by Nabokov, there's no question that, of judging where a recalled or adopted point of view is located within the scene in egocentric terms, because it doesn't seem that one is representing a scene. There is no point of view within a scene that needs to be located anywhere. In general, it seems like experiential remembering can represent that things once had a certain look without presenting how things looked on some occasion to oneself. So a related way to put this is to note that in the kind of case that the Nabokov passage illustrates, there's no scope for a from the inside, from the outside distinction, because there's no scene within which there could be a from the inside or from the outside. There's no representative perspective within a scene. Now, in noting all these things, we shouldn't think of there as being two distinct and exclusive kinds of remembering, a sort of preservative and faithful one, and a more constructive one. Instead, we should just think of these complementary processes interplaying to some degree or other, even in paradigm cases of episodic remembering. And so it seems like there are ways of experiencing recalling objects or persons which don't involve experiencing recalling events involving them. Now, there surely is some story to tell about the relation between Nabokov's past perceptual encounters with Mademoiselle and his present recollective experience. But that story doesn't need to terminate in the claim that he's now experientially recalling those past encounters. Before I wrap up, let me try to illuminate what I think is going on, to give some kind of positive account of these cases. We can start by noting that in general, experiential remembering with the aid of information acquired from past experiences doesn't entail that one is experienced recalling those past experiences. An analogy here might be that you can remember what the Mona Lisa looks like without remembering any event in which you saw it. And so with that idea, we might suggest that to experience and recall an object in this way that's independent of recalling events is to activate knowledge of its past perceptual qualities. For example, its typical look on past encounters. So in Nabokov's case, the information would seem to be knowledge of Mademoiselle's typical past look, generalized from across the many occasions on which he did perceptually encounter her. So to return to Don Locke, I think this way of casting things brings out what he seemed to have in mind, and he expresses it nicely in this passage. Someone who remembers that a certain shop was dark, dirty, and musty may be said to remember it, but I don't think he can be said to recall it unless he remembers not just that it was dark, dirty, and musty, but remembers the dark, the dirt, the musty smell. The idea is something like, we have knowledge for the past perceptual qualities of things, and by activating that knowledge in a way that's constitutively tied to multi-sensory mental imagery, we can experientially recall those things without thereby experientially recalling of the events in which we encountered them, the events in which we learned the looks that those things have. To bring things to a close then, I've argued that experiential recollection is not necessarily experiential recall of some event or events. Of course, in engaging experiential recall of an object or a person, one will know that there are experiences in one's past in which the thing or the person manifested this look or sound. So I'm not denying that there need to be perceptual encounters with the thing in one's past in order for one to be remembering. And this is why Swamp Man couldn't engage in the kind of recall we've been talking about. But it doesn't follow from those observations that those experiences are what one recalls. That what one experientially recalls are the past events in which one encountered the thing. I've given a description of what it would be to experientially recall a thing, which doesn't entail it. And the kind of knowledge you're activating isn't knowledge about your past experiences. In a sense, it's not phenomenal knowledge. It's knowledge about how the world was acquired from your past experiences. It's the relevant knowledge is knowledge of the past look of an object acquired from your past experiences of it. And in a way, this is plausibly propositional knowledge. Maybe you're inclined to think that means it's semantic memory. But unlike the typical instances of semantic memory, it seems essentially tied to capacities for engaging in appropriate mental imagery. So unlike remembering that the Battle of Hastings took place in 1066, which doesn't require me to engage in any mental imagery at all, whereas in the cases I've discussed, may end up being propositional knowledge, may end up being a part of semantic memory in a sense. And as I said, I'm not speculating on those matters. But the important point is it doesn't seem to be paradigm sort of typical episodic memory where your experience of recalling some event or events in your past in which you encountered the thing. And that brings us to the end. So thank you so much for watching. If you made it this far, I should let you know that there is a longer draft of this paper on my website if you're interested. If you have any questions or comments, I'd really like to hear them, so please do leave them down below in the comments section, and we can have a bit of a conversation. Yeah, thank you.